A raging river, a desperate cry, and a baby Mustang fighting for its life when a man stumbled upon the scene. He didn't think he acted what he did next would change both of their lives forever. This incredible story of bravery, survival, and the unbreakable bond that followed will leave you speechless. Stay with us to witness a journey that proves even the smallest acts of courage can create extraordinary miracles. Mark Callahan adjusted his worn cowboy hat against the early morning sun as he made his way along the edge of the Snake River. The recent storm had swollen the normally calm waters into a rushing torrent, carrying debris downstream. Mark was no stranger to floods in these parts, but something about the morning felt different, a sense of unease he couldn't shake. As he walked, the sound of rushing water was interrupted by something unusual, a faint, sharp cry like an animal in distress. He stopped, his ears straining to catch it again. The sound came once more, this time louder and more desperate. Mark's heart raced as he followed the noise. Pushing through the brush along the riverbank, he froze when he saw the source, a small, helpless Mustang pole, caught in the river's current, struggling to keep its head above water. The early morning sun rose over the Colorado plains, casting golden light across the Snake River as its waters roared violently. Mark Callahan, a rancher in his early 40s, made his way along the riverbank. His boots crunched against the wet gravel as he surveyed the aftermath of last night's storm. The rains had turned the once gentle river into a raging torrent, uprooting trees and carving fresh scars into the earth. Mark's eyes scanned the debris floating downstream, broken clumps of grass, and even pieces of fencing from his property. He adjusted his hat against the glare of the sun and muttered to himself, storm didn't hold back this time. For Mark, these walks were routine. After a heavy rain, he'd seen his share of damage over the years, but something about this morning felt different, uneasy. As he continued down the bank, a sound stopped him in his tracks. It was faint, almost drowned out by the rush of the river, but it was there, a sharp, desperate cry. Mark froze, tilting his head to listen. The cry came again, more urgent this time, cutting through the noise of the water. What the hell was that? He murmured, his heart beginning to race. He stepped closer to the river, his boots sinking slightly into the muddy ground. The cry came again, and this time Mark spotted movement in the water. His breath caught as he saw it, a small, dark shape bobbing in the current. It wasn't debris, it was alive. Mark pushed through the brush lining the riverbank, his pulse quickening as he drew closer. The shape came into focus, a FO barely a few months old, struggling to stay afloat. The chestnut-colored baby Mustang kicked its legs furiously, its head barely above the surface of the rushing water. Damn it, Mark whispered, his instincts taking over. Without hesitation, he dropped his jacket and boots on the ground, wading into the freezing river. The current was stronger than he expected, nearly knocking him off his feet as the icy water soaked through his jeans. Hold on, little guy, he shouted. Though the FO likely couldn't hear him, over the roar of the river the FO leaped out, another desperate cry, its eyes wide with terror as it fought against the current. Mark pushed forward, each step a battle against the force of the water. The closer he got, the harder the current pushed back, as if the river itself were determined to claim the struggling animal. When he was finally close enough, Mark reached out and grabbed hold of the foe's neck. The animal thrashed wildly, its panic only intensive. Ifeing, easy, easy, Mark said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. I've got you. He wrapped his arm around the foe's chest, gripping it tightly as he began the slow journey back to the shore. The weight of the animal combined with the relentless current made every step feel like a mile. His muscles burned and the cold water numbed his legs, but he refused to let go. When Mark finally reached the riverbank, he collapsed onto the muddy ground, the foe cradled in his arms. Both of them were soaked and shivering, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The FO, now out of immediate danger, stopped thrashing. Its small body trembled against Mark's chest, its dark eyes blinking up at him for a moment. Neither of them moved, as if both were processing what had just happened. You're safe now, Mark said softly, his voice hoarse. I've got you. He looked the F over, his heart sinking as he saw the full extent of its condition. Its legs were covered in scrapes, likely from being dragged along the rocks in the river, and its coat was matted with mud and Debris, it was painfully thin, its ribs visible beneath its damp. "For where did you come from?" Mark asked, though he didn't expect an answer. He glanced around, but saw no sign of other horses, no herd, no mother the foal. Let out a soft whimper, its head drooping against Mark's arm. "All right, kid," Mark said, pushing himself to his feet with a groan. "Leadin', get you out of here." Carrying the FO back to his truck was no easy task. The animal was heavier than it looked, and Mark's muscles were already aching from the struggle in the river. But he pressed on, determined to get the F to safety. When he reached the truck, he gently placed the FO in the bed lining. It with an old blanket he kept for emergencies. The FO curled up exhausted and closed its eyes. Mark climbed into the driver's seat, starting the engine. As he drove back to his ranch, he glanced in the rearview mirror, watching the F as it lay motionless in the backyard. "Tough one," he muttered, "but we'll get you fixed up, I promise." By the time they reached the ranch, the sun was high in the sky, casting long shadows over the barn and paddocks. Mark parked the truck near the barn and climbed out, carefully lifting the FO from the bed. As he carried it inside, he couldn't help but feel a sense of responsibility settle over him. This wasn't just about saving an animal, it was about giving it a chance to live, and Mark had a feeling that this FO's story was far from over. The FO lay motionless on the soft hay in Mark's barn, its chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Mark knelt beside it, gently wiping away the mud and debris from its chestnut coat with a damp cloth. Each stroke revealed more cuts and scrapes, and though none appeared life-threatening, it was clear the little Mustang had been through hell. "You're a fighter, aren't you?" Mark murmured, his voice steady but soft. He carefully examined the foal's legs, noting the deep scrapes along its knees and the swelling in one of its hind legs. It was too soon to know if the injury would heal properly, but he wasn't about to let doubt creep in. Now he stood and walked to the corner of the barn where he kept a small supply of veterinary tools. The local vet was miles away, and with no way to contact him immediately. Mark would have to do what he could. He grabbed a roll of bandages, a bottle of antiseptic, and some ointment before returning to the F's side. "This might sting a little," he said. As though the foal could understand, the small horse flinched as the antiseptic touched its wounds, letting out a weak cry. But Mark's steady hand never wavered. Once the wounds were cleaned and wrapped, Mark stepped back and let out a long breath. He couldn't remember the last time he'd felt so drained, not physically, but emotionally. There was something about this little horse, something he couldn't quite put into words. "Let's get you some water," he said, filling a small bucket and placing it near the foal's head. He knelt again, coaxing the FO to drink by gently stroking its neck. After a few moments, the Mustang's dark eyes flickered open, and it took a hesitant sip. "That's a kid, one step at a time." Mark said, a faint smile crossing his face. The day passed slowly. Mark checked on the FO every hour, ensuring it stayed comfortable and hydrated. He brought a bale of fresh hay into the barn, hoping the FO might feel strong enough to eat, but it remained too weak to do more than lift its head occasionally as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the ranch in shades of gold and orange. Mark sat outside the barn, his elbows resting on his knees. He stared out at the open fields, the wind rustling the tall grass. His mind wandered to the storm and the river, replaying the moment he'd seen the FO struggling in the water. "Where did you come from?" he said aloud, as though the FO might answer. Mustangs weren't uncommon in the area, but it was rare to see one so young. Without a herd, the next morning Mark was awakened by a faint sound coming from the barn. He threw on his jacket and boots, hurrying outside. As he entered the barn, he was greeted by a sight that made his chest tighten. The foal was standing. Its legs trembled beneath its weight, but it was upright, its head lifted as it sniffed the air. Mark's face broke into a grin. "Well, look at you," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "I knew you had some fight in you." He stepped closer, moving slowly to avoid startling the horse. The FO watched him intently, its dark eyes wary but calm. Mark reached out a hand, and to his surprise, the FO didn't shy away. Instead, it leaned forward slightly, its nose brushing against his palm. Mark's grin widened. "We're going to get through this little one over the next few days." Mark worked tirelessly to help the FO regain its strength. He fed it small portions of oats and hay, gradually increasing the amount as its appetite returned. He cleaned and rewrapped its bandages daily, and each time the FO seemed to trust him. A little more, he decided to name the FO River a nod to the place where their journey began. "You've got the spirit of the river in you," Mark told River one evening as they stood together outside the barn. The FO, now strong enough to walk short distances, nickered softly in response despite the progress. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that River's story wasn't complete. He had seen Mustangs before, wild, untamed creatures that roamed the plains in tight-knit herds. They were fiercely loyal to one another, and the idea that River had been separated from its family gwed at him. One afternoon, Mark saddled his horse Dakota and set out to explore the surrounding area. He rode along the river bank, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of a herd. If River's family was out there, he was determined to find them. The search proved fruitless. After hours of riding, Mark returned to the ranch, his shoulders heavy with disappointment as he dismounted Dakota and walked back to the barn. River greeted him with a soft nicker, its small frame leaning against the fence. Mark crouched down beside the FO, running a hand along its neck. "Looks like it's just you and me for now, kid," he said. River nudged him gently, and for a moment Mark felt a sense of peace. Whatever the future held, he knew one thing for certain: he wouldn't let River face it alone. The days passed in a steady rhythm as Mark and River settled into a routine. Each morning, Mark would check River's injuries, clean the wounds, and rewrap the bandages. The swelling in the foe's leg had begun to go down, and the cuts were healing nicely. River's strength was returning, and with it came a spark of energy that brought life back to the barn. One morning, as Mark entered the barn with a bucket of oats, he found River standing in the middle of the stall, its ears pricked forward and its dark eyes watching him expectantly. "Well, someone's feeling better," Mark said with a chuckle. Setting the bucket down, River took a few hesitant steps toward him, its movement still a bit unsteady, but full of determination. Mark held out his hand, letting the FO sniff his palm before giving its neck a gentle pat. "You're a tough little one, aren't you?" River nickered softly, a sound that made Mark's chest tighten with pride. As the days turned into weeks, River grew stronger, its coat regained shine, and the F's once thin frame began to fill out. Mark started taking River outside the barn, allowing it to explore the paddock and feel the grass beneath its hooves. At first, River was cautious, staying close to Mark as they walked around the enclosed space, but soon the foe's natural curiosity took over. It began trotting around the paddock, sniffing at the fence posts and nibbling on the tall grass. Mark watched with a smile, leaning against the fence. That's a kid get a feel for the world. Again, one afternoon, as Mark worked on repairing a section of the paddock fence, he noticed River watching him intently. The F stood a few feet away, a head tilted slightly as if trying to understand what he was doing. "You thinking about lending a hand?" Mark teased, wiping the sweat from his brow. River took a step closer, then another, until it was standing right beside him. Mark laughed, patting the foe's neck. "You're something else." You know that the bond between them had grown stronger with each passing day. Mark had always loved animals, but there was something special about River. The foe's resilience and trust had touched him in a way he hadn't expected. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Mark sat on the porch of his house, a cup of coffee in hand. River grazed in the paddock, its chestnut coat glowing in the golden light. Mark's thoughts drifted to the day he had pulled the FO from the river. At the time, he had seen it as a simple act of kindness, something anyone would have done, but now he realized it was more than that. Saving River had given him a sense of purpose, a reason to get up each morning with a renewed sense of determination. "You saved me as much as I saved you," Mark murmured, his gaze fixed on the FO. As River continued to grow stronger, Mark decided it was time to take the next step in the F's recovery. He wanted to introduce River to the open fields beyond the paddock to let it experience the freedom it had been denied. One crisp morning, Mark led River out of the paddock and into the wide expanse of his property. The FO hesitated, at first its ears flicking back and forth as it took in the unfamiliar surroundings. "It's okay," Mark said, giving the lead rope a gentle tug. "I'm right here." With a deep breath, River stepped forward, its hooves sinking into the soft grass. The foe's eyes widened as it took in the vastness of the open field, and after a moment of hesitation, it broke into a tentative trot. Mark laughed. Jogging to keep up, there you go, kid. That's what freedom feels like, Rivers. Confidence grew with each outing. It began running farther, testing its speed. And strength as it explored the fields. Mark often found himself standing in awe, watching the foal's transformation. The once fragile creature he had pulled from the river was now full of life and energy, its spirit unbroken despite everything it had endured. One evening, as Mark and River returned to the barn after a long day in the fields, Mark noticed something unusual. A faint sound carried on the wind, a distant whinny. River's ears perked up, and it let out a soft nicker. In response, Mark's heart raced. Could it be? The next morning, Mark saddled his horse Dakota and set out with River in tow. The sound from the previous night had sparked a sense of hope in him. If there were other Mustangs nearby, there was a chance they could be River's family. They rode for hours following the river. Upstream, the landscape grew wilder with rocky outcrops and dense thickets lining the banks. River walked beside Dakota, its movements steady and confident. As they rounded a bend, Mark spotted movement in the distance. A herd of Mustangs stood grazing near the water's edge, their coats gleaming in the sunlight. Mark's breath caught in his throat. Could this be it? Mark slowed Dakota to a halt, his heart pounding as he took in the sight of the wild Mustang herd grazing near the river. River, still tethered beside him, froze, its ears flicking forward and nostrils flaring. The FO let out a soft nicker, its body tensing with excitement and hesitation. Mark gently patted Dakota's neck and glanced down at River. "You recognize him, don't you?" he said softly, a mix of hope and sadness tugging at his chest. The herd was a breathtaking sight, powerful, free, and untamed. Their coats gleamed in shades of chestnut, black and gray, as they moved in unison, heads dipping to graze or rising to scan their surroundings. It was a stark reminder of what River had lost and what it might regain. Mark dismounted Dakota and crouched beside River, loosening the lead rope so the FO had more room to move. "All right, kid," he murmured. "If this is your family, now's the time to find out." River took a hesitant step forward, its small frame trembling as it sniffed the air. One of the Mustangs, a large mare with a similar chestnut coat, lifted her head, her ears flicking toward River. She let out a sharp whinny, and the entire herd froze, their eyes locking onto the FO. Mark held his breath, his hand resting on Dakota's reins as he watched the interaction unfold. The mare stepped forward cautiously, her movements slow and deliberate. River let out another nicker, this one louder and more urgent, and the mare responded with a deep, resonant whinny. The two stood still for a moment, their gazes locked as if recognizing something unspoken. Then, to Mark's astonishment, River took off. The F's movements were still unsteady, but there was a determination in every step as it ran toward the herd. Mark's heart swelled as the mare trotted forward to meet River, her nostrils flaring as she sniffed the FO. The rest of the herd watched from a distance, their bodies tense but calm. "Looks like you found your place," Mark whispered, a bittersweet smile on his face. The maid nuzzled River gently, her movements careful and deliberate. It was clear she recognized the FO, and as the two stood together, the rest of the herd began to relax. Several of the other horses stepped forward, sniffing River and welcoming it into their fold. Mark stayed where he was, not wanting to disrupt the reunion. He felt a lump rise in his throat as he watched River interact with the herd, the foe's energy shifting from nervousness to joy. "This is where you belong," he said quietly. After several minutes, Mark began to back away, leading Dakota toward the edge of the clearing. He didn't want to interfere with River's transition, but part of him ached at the thought of leaving the FO behind. Over the weeks they had spent together, River had become more than just a rescue. He was family. As Mark mounted Dakota and prepared to ride away, River turned. The FO let out a sharp whinny, its dark eyes locking onto Mark. Mark felt his chest tighten. "It's okay, kid," he said, tipping his hat. "You're home now." But River didn't move. Instead, the FO trotted back toward Mark, stopping a few feet away. The mare followed, her head tilting as she observed the interaction. Mark dismounted again, crouching to meet River at eye level. "What is it?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. River nuzzled Mark's chest. The Gesture filled with trust and gratitude, Mark placed a hand on the foal's neck, his fingers brushing against its soft coat. "You'll be all right," he said, his voice steady despite the tears welling in his eyes. "You've got a whole family." Now the mare stepped closer, presence calm and reassuring. River hesitated for a moment, then turned back toward her as if understanding what needed to happen. Next, Mark stood and watched as the FO rejoined the herd, his heart heavy, but fully stayed there for a long time, watching as River moved among the other Mustangs, gradually blending into the group. When the herd finally began to move away, Mark mounted Dakota once more. He sat silently, his gaze fixed on River, until the F disappeared into the distance. "You did good, kid," he murmured, turning Dakota toward home. "You did real good." That evening back at the ranch, Mark sat on the porch with a cup of coffee in hand. The barn felt emptier without River, but there was a sense of peace that hadn't been there before. He knew he had done the right thing, even if it meant saying goodbye. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Mark thought about the journey they had shared, the moment he pulled River from the raging river, the countless hours spent nursing the FO back to health, and the bond they had formed along the way. River had found his family, but Mark knew the FO would always hold a special place in his heart. The days after River's reunion with the herd were quiet on the ranch. The absence of the F's energetic nicker and curious glances left a noticeable void in Mark's routine. He had grown used to waking up to River waiting by the barn door, eager for the morning's care and attention. Now, as he walked past the empty paddock, he couldn't help but feel a pang of longing. Mark shook his head as he leaned against the fence, staring out at the open fields. "You did the right thing," he told himself, though the words felt hollow. River was where he belonged, running free with his family, but part of Mark wished he could have held on just a little longer. One afternoon, as Mark repaired a section of the paddock fence, he heard the faint sound of hoof beats in the distance. He paused, his heart leaping. For a moment, he thought it might be River, but as the sound grew louder, he realized it was coming from the other side of the property. Mark climbed onto Dakota and rode toward the source of the noise. His curiosity piqued as he reached the edge of the riverbank. He spotted the Mustang herd in the distance, grazing peacefully in the golden light of the afternoon sun. Among them was River, standing close to the chestnut M that Mark assumed was his mother. Mark watched from a distance, his emotions a mix of pride and sadness. River looked strong, his coat gleaming, and his movements full of confidence. The FO was no longer the weak, trembling creature Mark had pulled from the river. He had found his place in the world, and seeing him thrive filled Mark with a sense of fulfillment. But then something unexpected happened. River lifted his head and looked directly at Mark. The foal let out a soft whinny and began trotting toward him, leaving the safety of the herd. Mark dismounted, Dakota, his heart pounding as River approached. The FO stopped a few feet away, its dark eyes locked on Mark's. For a moment, it was as if no time had passed, as though they were back at the ranch, just the two of them. "You've got a good thing going here, kid," Mark said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "You don't have to come back to me." River stepped closer, nuzzling Mark's hand. The gesture was full of trust and gratitude, a silent acknowledgement of everything they had been through together. Mark ran his hand along River's neck, feeling the warmth of the foal's coat beneath his fingers. "You've come a long way," he murmured, "and I'm proud of you." After a few moments, River turned and trotted back to the herd. Mark watched as the chestnut M nuzzled the FO, welcoming him back into the fold. The herd moved as one, their movements fluid and graceful. As they continued grazing along the riverbank, Mark mounted Dakota, his gaze lingering on River until the herd disappeared from view. As he rode back to the ranch, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. River had found his place, and Mark knew he had done everything he could to give the FO a second chance at life. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Mark sat on the porch with a cup of coffee in hand. The air was cool, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink. He thought about River, about the bond they had shared, and the lessons the FO had taught him. Saving River had been more than an act of kindness. It had been a reminder of the importance of perseverance, of finding strength in the face of adversity. Mark knew he would carry those lessons with him for the rest of his Life as the first stars began to appear in the night sky, Mark smiled to. Himself, River was gone, but the memories they had created would stay with him. Forever, and in his heart, he knew their story wasn't over somewhere out there. River was running free, and that was all Mark needed to know. The weeks after River's departure marked a period of quiet reflection for Mark. The ranch, once alive with the foal's playful energy, now seemed still. Each morning, Mark found himself lingering by the empty paddock, half expecting to see River waiting for him, but the paddock remained empty, a bittersweet reminder of the bond they had shared. Despite the quiet, Mark felt a growing sense of pride every time he thought of River. The FO had not only survived, but had thrived, reclaiming the freedom that was his birthright. It was a story Mark often replayed in his mind, how a chance encounter by the river had changed both of their lives forever. One afternoon, as Mark was working in the barn, he noticed a truck pulling into the driveway. The vehicle's logo read Wild Mustang Preservation Alliance. A woman stepped out, her face framed by the brim of a wide hat. She introduced herself as CLA Reynolds, a conservationist who had heard about Mark's efforts to rescue River. "We're always looking for people who understand wild Mustangs," Claire said, extending her hand. "Your story with River is exactly the kind of dedication we need." Mark shook her hand, intrigued. "What can I do for you?" he asked. CLA explained that the Alliance was working to protect Mustangs from illegal trapping and displacement. They were establishing a network of safe zones where the horses could roam freely, and they needed someone with Mark's experience to help oversee the project. At first, Mark hesitated. The ranch was his home, and leaving it felt like an impossible task. But as CLA spoke about the growing threats to wild Mustangs, Mark felt a familiar sense of purpose stir within him. He thought of River and the countless other horses who might not be as lucky. This was his chance to make a difference, not just for one FO, but for an entire species. "I'll do it," Mark said, his voice steady with determination. Whatever it takes. The transition wasn't easy. Mark spent the next few weeks preparing the ranch for his absence, leaving it in the hands of a trusted neighbor. He packed his belongings and joined CLA and her team on their mission to protect the Mustangs. Together, they traveled across the plains, documenting herds, dismantling traps, and advocating for stronger protections. Through it all, Mark carried River's memory with him. Every time he saw a FO running beside its mother, he thought of the little chestnut Mustang who had taught him the value of resilience and trust. It was a reminder of why he had chosen this path and the impact one act of kindness could have. Months later, Mark found himself standing on the edge of a sprawling sanctuary, one of the largest safe zones the Alliance had established. The land stretched for miles, a mix of rolling hills, grassy plains, and shaded groves. Herds of Mustangs roamed freely, their movements graceful and unrestrained. As Mark scanned the horizon, his eyes caught sight of a familiar figure. A young chestnut horse stood at the edge of a grove, its coat gleaming in the afternoon sun. Mark's heart leapt as he recognized River, now stronger and more confident than ever. River lifted his head, his ears flicking forward. As he spotted Mark for a moment, they stared at each other, the connection as strong as it had ever been. Then, with a flick of his tail, River trotted toward the herd, disappearing into the sea of horses. Mark smiled, a deep sense of fulfillment washing over him. River was free, just as he was meant to be, and though their paths had diverged, their bond would always remain. Back at the Alliance headquarters, Mark sat with CLA and the rest of the team, sharing stories of their progress. The room was filled with hope and determination, a testament to the work they were doing. But for Mark, the real victory was knowing that River's story had sparked a movement, one that would ensure future generations of Mustangs could run free. As the meeting wrapped up, Claire turned to Mark. "You done something incredible," she said. "River's story has inspired so many people." Mark nodded, his thoughts drifting back to the little FO by the river. "I didn't just save him," he said quietly. "He saved me. 2 years passed, but the memory of River never left Mark." The little FO who had stumbled into his life remained a constant source of inspiration, not just for him, but for countless others who heard the story. Mark's work with the Wild Mustang Preservation Alliance grew into a lifelong mission. Together with his team, he helped establish new sanctuaries across the Country protecting wild Mustangs from threats and giving them a chance to thrive. Mark often visited the sanctuaries, walking among the herds and watching as the horses roamed free on. One of those visits, he spotted a familiar figure in the distance, a chestnut Mustang with a distinctive white mark on its chest. River stood at the edge of the herd, his head held high, a symbol of resilience and freedom. As Mark leaned against the fence, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. River was where he belonged, leading his herd and inspiring a new generation of Mustangs, and in a way Mark realized River had become a part of him, a reminder of the power of trust, compassion, and the courage to take a leap of faith. Turning to leave, Mark glanced back one last time. River lifted his head, their eyes meeting for a brief moment. It was as if the Mustang was saying thank you. Mark tipped his hat and smiled. Run free, kid. River's journey reminds us that even the smallest act of kindness can create ripples of change. If this story touched your heart, don't let it end here. Subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it with someone who believes in the power of second chances. Together we can spread the message of hope, freedom, and compassion for all living beings. Join us in making a difference